Welcome everyone. My name is John Spiker. Just kind of a little bit of background. I've always been, I've always had a Christmas display. Over the last few years, I actually went into xLights and a full automated digital display. What I'm going to go through tonight is some of the tools that I've used, some of the tools that you as a community have suggested to me to include in this. Some of them I actually myself had never heard of and recently bought. So thank you to everyone who's given those suggestions. I am by no means an expert in every tool. This presentation is really designed to give you an overall aspect of the things that are going to make you successful, and then hopefully potentially give you some ideas that you hadn't thought of previously as what you want to think about as you move through the year and building your display. So our agenda really is to talk about the essential electrical tools that you're going to need. And it's a very small list because luckily within this hobby, there's a lot of variables depending on how DIY you are or not. And then we're going to go through other things that are considerations. Same with building tools. Just a couple of the very essential building tools that you're going to need, and then a lot of considerations. And last but not least, as Ed mentioned, we're going to close it with some digital tools. So to start with that, we're going to start with, again, the essential electrical tools. And I'm sure at some point, all of our workbenches look like this. I know mine has through the years more than once. I'm sure yours has too. But that's the joy and the fun of this hobby is you get into it, you get working, and you get building, and then you get to see an awesome result. So I want to start with voltmeters. There's really two types of voltmeters that we look at. There's actually three, but I included two. Is the Pinto. Is just the very basic voltmeter that you want to consider, and then the higher end aspect. So let's kind of go through some pros and cons of each. In this particular example, I'm actually giving an example of a tool I have within my arsenal myself, and I use quite a bit. It's the free voltmeter from Harbor Freight. If you ever go to Harbor Freight, you know you get the coupons. You buy something for $1, you can use a coupon and get this voltmeter for free. It will suffice probably for 95% of anything you need to do in this particular hobby, whether it's measuring volts, whether it's measuring amps, or doing resistance/continuity testing on your pigtails, wires, etc. The one thing that I'll say against it is a very cheap tool because it's free, so it's not 100% consistently accurate. It is accurate, but not 100% consistently. On the other end of the spectrum, you have like the Fluke 117. It's an amazing voltmeter. It's accurate across the board on your volts, your amps, your resistance continuity testing. It also has some other cool features such as auto voltage. So go outside of the lighting community and say you have a motor home, that you have your generator for 110 and you have a lot of other stuff that's 12 volt. It'll auto detect the voltage for you so you know what you're playing with. So it has more capabilities beyond our hobby, but within our hobby, if you're testing circuit boards or you want really accurate continuity or resistance testing, it's a great tool. But the one con I'll say is, of course, it is a little more costly. And that's really a personal preference. But I'll reiterate the fact that for 90 to 95% of anything you're going to do in this hobby, this tool works just fine. There's no reason that you have to get a Cadillac version of a voltmeter. The next one along the lines is crimpers and strippers. I kind of put these in three separate different categories. Is auto strippers that I have on the left. I gave two different examples. The one on the far left was actually a recommendation from the community, so thank you. The other one, I actually posted a link earlier this week because Amazon had it on sale. I myself use it, and I'll say for tools that I have myself that I use, I will mention them through this presentation. Other ones I don't own, but that one I do own, and I can give a personal recommendation that it works very well. In the middle, we have the all-in-one, and I think this is a very common tool that people have in their arsenal of tools, where it's a stripper and it's a crimper all in one. It's a great universal tool for doing both aspects. And then last but not least is a crimper. And then this example is a ratcheting crimper that is specifically designed only for crimping itself. So there are pros and cons to each of them. You know, the pros to an auto stripper is you can do multiple wires all at once. You can actually have consistent spacing by using either the set gauge or your own methodology in looking at a wire and where you want to strip it. And they're fast. They're really fast. You need to strip, you know, you're doing pixels and you're doing putting pigtails on them hypothetically. You can quickly strip the sheathing, you can quickly strip the wires, and you're on your way. You're not doing it one at a time, it's all together. And I will say the reason I included the other one that I don't personally have is one of the comments that I saw on the forums is the one I recommended is great for people that are right-handed, not so good for people that are left-handed, whereas the one on the left seems to be universal for left and right-handed people. I haven't had an opportunity to use one, but you know, either I'm assuming would be a great use and a great tool. The downside is they are normally a little more expensive unless you have a great deal like we had this week. The all-in-one stripper and crimper, it's one tool for everything. You know, that's probably the biggest pro for it. You can do your stripping, you can do your cutting and your crimping, and you have all one tool in your hand. And this really might be a good selection if you're trying to fix out in the field, or if you're in a hurry, you don't want to carry a bunch of tools with you. It's definitely a great solution. The downside to it is it can be time consuming. And, you know, I say time consuming, that really is relevant. It's, you know, everybody has a different perspective of, you know, what time consuming really means. It takes you an extra 10 seconds or an extra 30 seconds. It can be time consuming. The other thing that I've seen in my own use of them is the crimping can be inconsistent because it really is dependent about how much force you put yourself on that particular crimp. You know, it's not like it's accurate every single time as it was the time before. Small consideration, I get that and I know that, but it's just something to think about. And a ratchet and crimper, the auto crimping is one of the, you know, the probably the biggest pro on it, and it's consistent and solid. It ratchets down, it hits a certain point each and every time, exactly the same. But then again, it is a single-use tool. But if you're somebody that's not going to be soldering, or you don't use the solder sleeves and you're crimping everything, it's a great, you know, it's a great tool to have in your arsenal because it's quick, it's easy, and you know you have a consistently solid connection. Obviously, the other drawback is cost with a single-use tool, but it is something to think about. I actually myself don't have one, and last year I think I wish I would have when I realized how much crimping I actually had to do when I didn't expect to do any. Wire cutters. There's a lot of wire cutters out there, and a lot of different types of wire cutters for different uses. But within our hobby, I tried to narrow it down to the most common that we would potentially use. So I have side cutters, also known as dikes, and then micro flush cutters. Side cutters, the biggest pro is you probably already own them. They're probably already in your toolbox. You've been using them for years, and they're great all around. I will say though, because of how much wire cutting we do, having a good sharp set is is recommended, not required, but recommended. I myself use the channel locks. I like them. I haven't had a single issue with them, and I haven't done anything wrong against me. But the one thing I will say is they're not good for precision. If you want to do precision, you really need to look at micro flush cutters. These cutters are in particular are for precision cutting. They will, you know, if you're doing a circuit board, for example, they will go flat against the board if you really, really want to. The downside is they are limited up to 16 gauge wire. So for pixels and other things of that nature, they'll work fine. But obviously you are limited to the size of wire that they're able to actually cut. Next, I'm going to kind of go through a laundry list of other electrical considerations: soldering iron, fuse holders, power connectors, zip ties, etc. All the other things that are not going to be required for you to set up your display, but things that you probably want to consider. The first and foremost, I think, is the most valuable tool in all of our arsenals is zip ties. I don't know a single display out there that doesn't use a ton of zip ties. With that, there's also the zip tie gun. This is not something that you necessarily have to have, which is why I don't consider it an essential tool, but I think it's a tool that will make your life easier. And the fact that it'll pull the zip tie tight for you and cut it all in one particular stroke. So you're not taking and tearing apart your fingers, pulling zip ties, and then taking your dikes and cutting them. It just leads to a little more convenience as you're setting your display up and building props in particular. Solder sleeves, heat shrink butt connectors. These are two options that I know a number of people in the hobby use. Solder sleeves are designed to allow you to take and mesh two wires together, and then from there, go ahead and melt the solder in the middle and then heat shrink it all at once. So one thing I'm going to mention about the solder sleeves is I know that I've seen a lot of people say, I'm not able to use them. They don't work well. I myself have had issues with them, but the key to them is even in consistent heat, not using, say, not using a torch, for example, using a heat gun and heating it up evenly and slowly, from what I understand and I've been told, works really, really well in getting that solder to meld across the wires and seal it properly. The heat shrink butt connectors, going back to the ratcheting butt connector, would work really well together where you can get a good, solid, even, consistent crimp on those wires and then be able to seal them with your heat gun, or if you use a micro torch or whatever, to go ahead and have that heat shrink seal around it. Both great aspects if you're not into soldering. They're just options that are out there and available to you. Heat gun mini torch. A heat gun, I didn't think when I first started in this hobby that I would ever need a heat gun. I learned really quickly that a heat gun is very, very useful for whether you're doing the heat shrink solder sleeves, whether you're doing the butt connectors. They work very, very well on heat shrinking for you quickly, easily, evenly, and cleanly. The same with a mini torch. Mini torches can do the same thing, obviously not nearly as adjustable because it is a torch and it's a flame, but I do love my mini torch for out in the field. So if I have to go out and replace pixels, I'll take it out with me and it's a quick fix to, put the heat shrink back on, whether I'm just wrapping it back together, depending on what I'm doing. It's great portable for in the field work. Both of them great things to have in your arsenal. Again, not required, but definitely helpful. Heat shrink. So heat shrink comes in a lot of varieties. And when I first started, I personally didn't know all of the varieties. I just thought heat shrink was heat shrink. Well, on the left, you can see that I'm demonstrating that there's different shrink ratios from 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1. These shrink ratios allow you to maybe purchase heat shrink that's a little larger than you need for regular pixel wire, but can also work for other elements in your display, whether you're putting pigtails on. And the compression ratio will then dictate all the way down to the wire size and still evenly be able to, you have one heat shrink type or size that can be multi-use depending on the shrink ratio you get. I will say, obviously, a 3-to-1 is going to be more expensive than a 2-to-1, and then a 4-to-1 obviously more expensive than a 3-to-1, and that's really going to be a personal preference. The flip side of that is heat shrink comes in two other variables. One where it doesn't have adhesive lining, and then ones that do come with adhesive lining. The nice thing about the ones that are pre-made with adhesive lining, they're actually dual wall heat shrink where it shrinks and it seals at once. So it'll water seal your connection and enclose it all in one. So you know that wire connection is protected from the elements and 100% on a water penetration level. Soldering irons. They come in many, many, many varieties. Your electric soldering irons, you can get your super cheap ones to your higher end ones. Personally, I use Heiko. I like Heiko. This is Not the one I have personally. I have an older model because I've used Heiko for a long time. But the nice thing about the, at least a medium mid-grade soldering iron is that it has adjustable temperature. So whether you're soldering a circuit board or whether you're soldering wires themselves, you can set the soldering iron based upon the application you're currently using it for. If you're planning on your display to do a lot of soldering iron, a lot of soldering, I should say, it would be worth your time and investment to look at least a mid-grade soldering iron for your particular needs. Along those same lines is a gas iron. Gas irons are actually very useful, especially in the field. Just like the mini torch, they can, you can take it out there with you and solder on the field. You don't have to worry about plugging power or anything else. The one thing about the gas irons, as far as what I've been told and what I've read, is it's much more difficult to control the temperature of the tip. So it may be, or it may be not, somebody in this group can probably enlighten me, other uses for them. This was definitely a suggestion from you guys, so thank you. The one thing I will say is extra tips. If you're going to get a soldering iron, make sure you have extra tips in your arsenal. If you're doing wires, you probably want a little bigger blade. If you're doing circuit boards, you're going to want a fine tip. Having extra tips of varying sizes and varying angles will go a long way and make your life a lot easier when you're, depending on what you're trying to solder. It's picking the right tool for the right application. In this case, it's the electronics in our displays. And then, of course, a great tip cleaner. I've tried a number of different tip cleaners. I've found that the Heiko 599B to be the best for me. There may be others that are great for you, but I've had great success with this particular one. Fuse holders, blocks, distro boards. So, fusing is a lot of what we do in our display. There's certain things that should be fused. There's other things, it's debatable whether you not need to fuse it or not, but how you fuse it is up to you. The inline fuses are great. I mean, if you have a single wire application that you need to fuse, then they work very well. You can change, obviously, the fuse itself individually for that particular wire, depending on what, it's going to. Fuse blocks are very similar in the same aspect. If you have a large amount of voltage coming in that you need to spread out and you want to individually manage the size of the fuse blocks work great for that also. Or, your last one that I think is very, very common in our hobby is distro boards. The power distribution boards are really designed for our hobby. They have the ability to plug, both your positive and your negative into, or your positive and ground into a single output and have that fused individually. And in this example, it's an 8-port one that I'm displaying here. Connectors. I can't tell you how many conversations I've seen on all the forums about the different types of connectors. Obviously, the most common that we use in our display are pigtails. I don't really think I can have to go into much detail about what a pigtail is, because I think everyone knows what one is. But from the pigtail aspect, you also have some other considerations. An IDC connector. These were actually originally designed for, I believe, the telecom industry. And the nice thing about them is that they're quick and easy to snap. They're great for field work. If you need to swap out pixels. The other nice thing is they're built in with dialect grease to ensure that you have not only a watertight seal, because they're obviously for the telecom industry, they're designed for the elements already. It's a consideration as far as something in your arsenal to keep or think about. The next one that I personally use quite a bit in my display are called Delphi connectors. They come in different variations of you know uh, connectors, whether it's 3-prong, 2-prong, 4-prong, et cetera, et cetera. They initially are designed for the automotive industry. And I look at it, if they're designed to be in the, undercarriage of a vehicle or in the engine compartment of a vehicle, I'm pretty sure their waterproofness is equivalent to what we're going to use them for in our displays. I actually exclusively use those myself for power injection. And then last but not least is dielectric grease. Dielectric grease is, I guess the best equation I can give to it is, if you live in the Midwest where it's a rainy area, I know a lot of people say grease the undercarriages of their car to make sure that they don't rust. Well, the same with electronics. The dielectric grease, whether it's on a pigtail IDC connector or your Delphi connectors, will isolate the electronic connection from water. So even if water does penetrate, it'll bead around it and hopefully not short circuit it. Not required, but something to consider depending on your elements. Me being in Southern California, really not the biggest concern because we don't get rain, but something I still look at and consider depending on the element and where the plugs are going to be sitting on my display. So the next one is, for networking, because obviously our shows are all ran off of a network, whether you're running, Raspberry Pis with FPP, whether you're using xScheduler, you have network continuity around your entire display to keep it up and running. An RG45 tester is great to have in your arsenal of tools, because if you have, say that one of your devices seems to be hanging up or is not reacting the way you expect it. Could it be a bad network connection? Well, with an RJ45 tester, you can definitely go out there and go, is this particular network cable actually coming through cleanly, or does it have an issue? Or if you have a rat's nest, you can actually find what wires connected to what. It's just a consideration. Obviously, again, a lot of these, I'll repeat myself, not required, but maybe something to think about in your arsenal of tools as we, to try and diagnose issues that may or may not come up. And then, of course, along that same line is an RJ45 crimper. If you decide, not to buy pre-built wire and you're going to make your own specific to length, you're going to want a crimper to make those network cables. Again, that's really a personal preference. Personally, I just buy everything pre-made because I'm lazy. And last but not least, in this category is other stuff to think about. Pass-through connectors, waterproof for, if you're doing enclosure builds and you want to send your network cable through into your bud box or your CG1500 or your toolbox, like I built some of mine out of. You want a way to connect your network cable and have it be waterproof. Pass-through connectors for networking, power, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, are definitely, a consideration. One that I've seen recently come up in conversation is not necessarily specifically buck converters, but what a buck converter can do. So in this particular picture, what I'm showing is a buck converter that is designed to have an input of 12 volts and an output of 5 volts, 3 amps, which should be significant, significant to run, say, your Raspberry Pi. So their buck converters are specifically, whether it's this one or a 12 volt or a 24 volt, 12 volt step down, is to take a certain voltage and step it down to another lower voltage. So something to think about, depending on how you set up your display or what you're trying to accomplish. And then last but not least is nylon screws. Everything we deal with is electronics. Nylon screws are non-conductive. And here in this particular kit I'm showing has not only the screws, but the standoffs and the specific size on them. And I probably should have mentioned it here. They're all 3M screws in this one, which are usually about the same size as all of our circuit board holes. As I take a deep breath, because that was a whole lot of talking really fast, the next area we're going to go through is our essential building tools. So, the building tools, before I get into it, are subjective depending on how much of a DIY person you are and what you're trying to do. These are, again, very subjective. So when it comes to xEssential tools, I only have one, and it's a ladder. At some point, setting up our displays, we're all going to need to use a ladder. And I really wanted to specifically call out the difference between an aluminum ladder and a fiberglass ladder. I don't recommend an aluminum ladder, and it's not that they're not a good ladder. It's not that they can't be used in our setups. But the one thing is they will conduct electricity. I know our displays are 5 volt, 12 volt, 24 volt, and that's really not going to harm you. It's not going to do anything. But there are times where working around 110 or 220 or 240, depending on where you are in the world. And the last thing I would like to see is somebody get hurt just because their ladder was conducted electricity. So I always recommend for our hobby, if you're going to buy a ladder, always buy a fiberglass ladder. It's just a safety first thing. Not dissing the aluminum one, just saying safety first, fiberglass. Well, it's just a little safer. And I forgot to change the title. So other building considerations. Pipe wrench, drills, cutoff saw, router, micrometer, measuring tape, levels. These are everything I'm going to go through now are really just considerations and really subjective to what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish. But it's just the idea is to maybe put some ideas in your head and things to think about. So I saw a post earlier today about drilling tools. It wasn't specific for drilling, it was for something else. But starting on the left, a portable drill. I myself use mine continuously in my display. So I have a higher end DeWalt. You don't need it. Harbor Freight sells them for I think 20 or 30 bucks that work really well. But if you're going to do a lot of drilling with your hand drill like I do, consider a higher end one. And it's really not just our displays, it's what you do around the house. Um, Same with the drill press. The one I'm showing here is actually Harbor Freight's, I believe it's the 8-inch one. And I have the 12-inch one. This is the one right below it. But the 8-inch one is $80, 70 or $80. And if you're just doing PVC pipe or you're doing small stuff of that nature, there's no reason to get a high-end drill press. A cheap one like this will do you just fine and allow you to accomplish setting up your display. Again, it's personal preference depending on what your end goal is and your total utilization of those particular tools. So I put this one big, a large pipe wrench. The reason is this year it was at my absolute lifesaver is if you want to get rebar out of the ground, I know Ron Howard did a video using a little crescent wrench, a large pipe wrench, 2 twists, and you'll pull 4 or 5 feet of rebar out of the ground very easily. Not required, not needed, but if you're pounding rebar in the ground or you're putting together an ASAP pole or whatever, having a large pipe wrench in your arsenal will save your back. It saved mine, I know that. So it's kind of why this one was added in, just a personal preference. Measuring tools. Measuring tape, you're going to want a measuring tape no matter what, because at one time or another, whether you're measuring your house for xLights to figure out how many potential pixels, if I do 4-inch spacing or 5-inch spacing or 3-inch spacing, you're going to need to know the dimensions of your house. So a measuring tape, this is an example of another free Harbor Freight tool, or obviously there's the larger 100-foot ones, etc. But you probably want a measuring tape in your arsenal and maybe variations thereof. I myself have a 100-foot one that I use quite a bit, especially doing house outlines or the front of my property or border lines, etc. But then again, it's individualized to the particular person's layout and what they're trying to accomplish. Um, Having a level, you wouldn't think to yourself, why would I need a level in this hobby? Well, a good example I can give to it is setting up a mega tree. If you're setting up your base, you're going to want to make sure the base is level. That the top's level, you want the bottom level so your strips are level and your mega tree looks good. Or if you're doing yard borders, making sure that the yard borders level all the way around. So for that aspect, I would say, you'd want a little larger of a level, maybe 24 inches plus, depending on your layout, depending on your setup and your house. But it's something to think about. So, and then a micrometer. I put the micrometer in is probably going to be a less used tool, but it is a tool that I found myself using quite a bit in my first couple of years of setting up my display. When I got new circuit boards or, I got new distro boards or I got whatever, I really wanted to know what's the hole spacing? You know, if I can't find it online to give me the layout, I could use it to tell me where to drill into, you know, a plastic plexiglass sheet if I'm building a box or whatever. Very helpful in those areas in setting that up. Again, all personal preference depending on your need. So saws, I mean, it's these two in particular, again, are depending on what you're trying to accomplish and what you're building. Having a table saw at your disposal can be very, very helpful. Not required, but you know, it can be helpful. The miter saw, same situation. I used mine quite a bit building my P10 enclosures, but not required. You know, it depends on what you're trying to set up and what you're doing, and again, your DIY level. But tools to consider. And in this aspect, I have the portable one just because I don't use a table saw on a regular basis. It's nice to be able to fold it up and put it in the corner of the garage and not have to worry about it. So other stuff. I'll start with the on the right this time. A headlamp. I probably should have put this at one of the very beginning of the presentation. Having a headlamp will save you lots and lots of frustration. You know, especially when our displays are running at night and something goes wrong and you have to be out there in the dark. Having that headlamp to be able to be the light for your eyes without having to hold a flashlight, etc., extremely helpful. You know, and then having a high lumen one to really light it up will make your life a lot easier. Not required, but a luxury to make your life a little easier in this particular hobby. And then I added the honing device because it really was around if you're building an ASAP pool. One of the things you have to build is the slip ring. And part of building that slip ring is you need to take the internal threads off. The one way, the cleanest and easiest way that I found to do it, that was consistent to keep it from being oblong, is a honing device. They make multiple kinds of them. This is just a representation of one that's actually used for automotive brakes, but it'll allow you to hone it out to build for that particular aspect. And I'm sure in building your displays, there's other uses that you might find useful for something of this nature. Um, with our physical tools, I think the most valuable tools we have in this hobby are the digital tools that allow for us to make our lights go blink and help us plan to make those lights go blink. Um, so I'm going to start off with going over here to xLights. So on the homepage of xLights, there's obviously a number of resources. I would be remiss if I didn't say there's the donate button. I encourage everybody who can afford it, and it's not a requirement, but if you can afford it, donate to the xLights team. They do this for free. They do it out of the passion of their hearts to make sure that you guys have successful displays. And it's not free to run everything. There is cost behind it. For example, this particular website isn't free to host, as an example. But I know it's truly appreciated by all of the developers of xLights, that for those of you who do donate. But for those of you who have come to the xLights website and maybe not paid attention to all of the things that are here, there's actually a couple things. I'm just going to point out quickly is the video section. This is the compilation of all of the videos, including the video I'm doing right now, will actually be up here. And it's a great resource for you to be able to learn and get ideas. Beyond that, if I go back to the home page, just do xlights.org. Obviously the downloads, the forum, but there's also the resources tab. And I don't know how many people have come here, but underneath the resources is xLights specific resources, quick start guide, frequently asked questions, the video tutorials, all of the Facebook groups that are associated with xLights and the information that they provide for you. And then down here, they have their miscellaneous useful links. And those are the ones I'm going to focus on right now because they are really more along the lines of tools. So if I go back to the presentation, and the first one I'm going to talk about, oh, okay, well, I just started right where I was, is so lightshowhub.com actually has this Megatree calculator and simulator. What this can allow you to do is take the dimensions of your megatree, the number of strings that you're planning on, the pole height you're planning on, the spacing you're planning on, and it'll give you a visual representation of that particular tree and allow you to play with it to get an idea of what it would take for you to set up in your own display. And if I go over here, and I'll give just a quick example, if I wanted to do 16 strings and 50 or 16, 1, 6, why is 1, 2, I don't know. The top spacing, the bottom spacing, the inches. Down here, it'll give you all of the details, the number of pixels per string, the total number of pixels for that particular tree, depending on your top to height ratio, the length per string. But it gives you enough information to be able to look at what could that tree potentially look like. It's a useful tool when planning planning your mega tree as part of your overall layout. And if I just start it, there we go. The next one, I'm not going to go into it because it's going to take a little more time, but the website piscaleapp.com, what it allows you to do is take an image and pull it in as an actual pixel image. And in this representation here is actually one of the images for my mega tree that's 32 by 100, in which I pulled in the Grinch and was able to pixel by pixel edit it to make sure that it matched what I expected. So on my tree, I knew exactly what that image was going to look like based upon the information here. And then you can see over here, it gives you more of the condensed version rather than the blown up version. It's, in this pixelapp.com, the link is on the resources page of xlights.org. I recommend anybody who's looking to get more precision on the images and trying to scale them appropriately. This will do auto scaling up, auto scaling down. Um, Highly recommend it. I use it quite a bit myself. And then the next one is spikerlights.com, the pixel power calculator. I don't know much about this, but I do know that it allows for you to, take a pixel count, and I'll use an example of 300 pixels, and it'll auto calculate and tell me, based upon the pixel watts I have, the spacing, my voltage, where my voltage drop's going to be. You can change this, you can adjust it. I know most of the pixels nowadays are 0.6 watts, for example, but you can play with it. You can add injection points, etc. It's a tool that's free. It's out there available to you. And the link's provided on the resources page. It's also right there. So it's easy to get to directly from xLights. The xLights project exists because of people like you. Help continue the project by donating today at xlights.org/donate.